thank you all for joining. We have actually a very interesting panel today. Ed Amoroso will lead the group of experts, including Bob Bigman, Bonnie Stith, and Ed Brindley. And Ed, the ball is in your field.
Well, thank you, Yossi. Thank you for inviting us to speak. We've got some really wonderful guests here who are going to be commenting. And thanks to each of you for making some time today to be part of our discussion. I know everyone's going through a change in work habits. And if you're like me, then webinars are one of the bright spots of spending more time at home. So we appreciate you spending time with us. We promise that we'll try to give you good information. I can tell you one thing, that if you have admiration for three-letter agencies, then you've got the right three people here who'll be speaking. So I suspect they'll be able to provide a lot of useful insight for you. Just a little preface here. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of chat as a panel for a little over half an hour, maybe 40 minutes or so. And then we're going to make sure there's a lot of time for your questions. So we'll stick around and try and get as many answered. We'll monitor them, and if the same question is being asked 5 or 6 times, then we'll just try and answer it once. We'll do the best we can. The general nature, the general tenor here is around threat landscape. We did some prep sessions before this meeting, and as we talked threat landscape, it was impossible to ignore the fact that COVID-19 is going on, and it was impossible for us not to draw analogies between cybersecurity and the biological virus that we're dealing with. So you'll probably see some references to that. But really the general nature, and I'm going to ask Bonnie and Bob and Ed in that order to just say a couple of intro words, a little bit about themselves and background, and then their thoughts. But we're going to kind of focus on threat landscape. But we also found ourselves traveling in the direction of OT security and industrial control, and Yossi's one of our resident experts in finding rogue devices, and that's certainly an important thing that I think a lot of you probably are expecting to hear a little bit about. So the discussion will travel, but we've not scripted it. We're hoping that organically we'll just find some really, really interesting insights here. And I think with the 3 guests that we've got, that will be impossible not to happen. So Bonnie, I'm going to start with you and ask you to maybe talk a little bit about yourself and share your thoughts in this general area, and then we'll go to Bob and Ed, and then we'll get into our discussion.
I retired a couple of years ago from the CIA, and my last position was director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence in the newly created at the time Director of Digital Innovation. That was not how I started my career, however. I'm going to apologize because my dog seems to be whining at the door, but I started my career as an operations officer doing operations work primarily in the third world. But I think overseeing the center helped me understand both the defense piece that had to go on, understanding the threat helped manage the attack a little bit, but also helped inform better on what we were looking at and who was doing it. In the early days of my entry into the cyber threat business, it was primarily questions about what was going out. By the time I left, it wasn't, the questions had changed to what could we do to stop what was going on. We knew who was doing it. We saw the signatures. We could recognize them. The analytic piece of what we were doing had gotten so powerful that the question and the tenor of the question changed significantly to how we would stop these attacks versus what was the attack. So, and I will leave it at that.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. And by the way, there's nothing nicer than hearing a dog in the background. I'm sure all the years you spent in a skiff, you probably missed having your pet there with you. So nice.
Yeah, there were plenty of dogs in our skiff too, by the way.
Well, Bob, let's go to you. Let's hear a little bit about your
Bob Bigman. I am a cybersecurity consultant with companies and governments around the world, multinationals and frankly of all size. I provide consulting on technology, threats, risks, the Russians, the Chinese, whatever is of interest to the CISOs. I also spent 30 years at the CIA doing cybersecurity, all defensive. And the last 15 years, I was the CISO. Just to answer your question about the threat landscape of what we're seeing, With my clients, I talked to a number of them just as late as this morning, and we are seeing increased activity. It's interesting that the bad guys, we'll collectively call them the gang over in Russia, they seem to be looking for laptops and PCs that are personally owned and are running RDP and VDI, right? Because they know what's on the other end of these connections. And they're basically dropping all different types of reconnaissance software to see if they can break into some of these sessions, steal some of these credentials, and see if they can get into the corporate access network. So we are seeing an increase. What's interesting though is it doesn't seem to be what I think a lot of people thought was going to happen was going to be a dramatic increase. I mean, it's everyone says, yeah, we see but it's pretty much a blip. So either the bad guys right now are also hunkered down and protecting themselves from the coronavirus, or the increase is just not seem to be that that difficult to deal with.
Or when you're already soaking wet, another bucket of water over your head,
right.
Not a big deal, right? Well, thanks, Bob. We'll come back to that because everybody's been talking unmonitored RDP lately, and that's certainly something we'll want to check in a little more on. So, Ed, why don't you share a little bit about your very impressive background as well?
Ed Brindley. I'm a vice president at Plex Cyber, which, as the name might imply, we're a cybersecurity company. I grew up. Most of my early career was in the military and the defense and intel business. I had an Army career early on, and I actually got to do the job. I tell you, a lot of folks, if you talk to them about MI back in the day, a lot of folks spent time, painting various buildings and rocks. And I was really fortunate to have gotten to do the job. I was a language analyst in the early part of my career, and I later developed collection systems and was a part of the intelligence enterprise at NSA. What's interesting to me is early on we would watch things happen, and I think as time progressed we became more motivated to do something, as Bonnie mentioned earlier, motivated to take action. We had to do something to prevent attacks, and I think that's the brilliance of the intelligence enterprise, is the deep insights that they offer. And now I think where we're at with cybersecurity is, what can we do to take advantage of what we know about the enemy, and what can we do to better protect and defend America and her interests, the companies that underpin critical infrastructure, transportation, and lots of other things. So I'm really glad to have joined the group here today, and pleased to have the opportunity to talk to a great audience.
That's great, Ed. Ed, let's stay right with you. So given your background at NSA, it'd be good to comment on the following. So we've all seen this big change now in the way computing infrastructure is operating. We're all home for the most part. I think probably everybody on this call is sitting in their den in their living room, using a very different network traversal and access method, and their local broadband, and on and on and on and on. I'm curious, as you guys did the analysis and over the years thinking about threat, was change a big driver in kind of creating risk? Whether the change is good, bad, or whatever, just a big change, it always struck me as something that got my antenna up. I don't know. It's like, I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's different. Is that something, like, as people are listening, is that something they should have as a takeaway here, that, whether you're working home or, it's just different, and different means risk? Am I reading that right? Is that the way you guys would think about that problem?
Yes, absolutely. Early on, I'll tell you, when early in my career, the intelligence portion of my career, we talked a lot about intelligence, but cyber was something else. It was different. It was C2C. We called it computer to computer, and those were the days that was a small mission. And I think things have evolved. It's evolved to we'd say the Internet of Everything. It's in your house. It's in your car. It's amazing how much technology is in everything that we buy, everything that we plug in. We have connected homes. We have connected transportation infrastructure. So I think you have to be willing to change with the times, and you have to be willing to adapt. and evolve. And I think you have to think about how that changes your risk profile. That's something that doesn't always come easy. You have to take a step back and think differently about how the world is operating and will be operating next, Ed.
You think government and commercial generally treat those things the same way, or do they usually make different decisions about that issue?
I think they do make very different decisions about those issues. I'll give you a few great examples. The government historically has had a very high degree of care about securing communications, and it isn't just confidentiality, it's making sure that the integrity of the communications is protected so that your systems or communications can't be tampered with. Availability is something that the government cares about. Often the government cares about these things with little regard for schedules and operational impacts, whereas commercial enterprises are motivated to get to market. You see that at scale right now. You see that in the space community with the move toward the commercialization of space,
Yeah.
different views of how that might be done. I think a lot of industry looks to get to how can we do it as close to as securely as we'd like to do it, but to be able to do it at scale in a way that I don't think that we have historically thought in the same terms in government.
Interesting. Now, Bob, you had mentioned a minute ago that your clients were telling you that BDI and remote desktop protocol, things like that, are vulnerabilities. You and I and Bonnie and Ed, every Yossi, we would all know that the monitored ports running those things are dangerous. How in the world do we get people to kind of listen that there are some basic things that they should be doing, but for whatever reason just don't? I know in your career, you've probably seen people make every mistake in the book. Do we need a coronavirus kind of thing to shake people into listening to the basics of cybersecurity, or can we ever get to where best practices are actually followed in things like managing networks? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's in two parts, right? When you look at RDP, for example, in most of the clients I worked with, it's mostly configured right. The problem is the product itself sucks. I mean, it's written on bad code, right? They've got, the code base for RDP right now in Microsoft is so big. It's got tons of buffer overflows, and God knows what the hell's going on inside that mass of that jungle bungle of code. And the bad guys have access to the source code. They're just finding the little holes that you can, if I input this, collection of bits down the path, I think I'll get this response back, right? So it's very frustrating for a lot of CISOs I work with who, they turn on every right whistle, right, every bell. They have it configured as best they can, but it's bad. It's a bad product. So that's the first part. Yeah, you're right. The second part is we get a lot of people who just don't know, what to do. The problem is with technology is, like it's trying to teach your grandmother, the difference between signature and heuristic malware protection, which I tried to do one time. It didn't work very well. It's too complicated. We got to make these products to be, as we've discussed this before, secure out of the box, right? You have to be able to install it, and no product works this way, right? It took us a while just to get, Citrix set up the right way to run in a secure mode. It should be so simple that the end user gets the product, downloads it, turns it on, and it basically installs itself in the most secure configuration possible. And the people who produce the product also configure the system from a security perspective and ensure it's working at a high level. The idea that we can expect individuals to understand every detail of their browsers and the settings within their browsers, right? It's just ridiculous. They're not IT professionals. They're people trying to get a job done, and we too often in the IT and IT security business, we miss that fact, and we engineer our products without them.
Yeah, that's very well put. Bonnie, you've had such a wonderful career thinking about threats and understanding how those threats can produce pretty significant consequences. Curious what you think about the current threat landscape in cyber. Does it kind of match up with some of the more tangible risks that you know, intelligence agencies would worry about? Have we reached the point where cyber is something that we really do need to worry about? And I'm going to ask Yossi in a minute to comment on the a little bit, get us into OT. But what do you think, Bonnie? Is the risk in cyber now commensurate with other more scary risks that we've thought about for a long time?
Yeah, I would just tell you that, I mean, one of the things that we focused heavily on, you know, as my daughter-in-law would say, back at the Gap, but you know, a couple of years ago even, was trying to convince people that cyber was espionage. Because there's this idea that what I do on my phone or on my computer, you know, I can still somehow or other hide in the noise, I can still disappear, I can operate in the margins. There are no margins anymore. I mean, you are identified, there's signatures that are identified to you. You've created a virtual, you know, basically data flow around you. So you are easily identified by how you move through cyber, you know, through your community, however that is. If you look at today's news, Google and Microsoft, I think, or Google and Facebook or somebody are trying to figure out how to help you understand if you've been exposed to coronavirus by who you were standing next to for a period of time. I mean, so they're trying to, I don't know if you get to actively enable your phone to do this or whether they're going to passively enable your phone and then you get an alert saying, hey, you've been exposed. There's this piece that's going on around you all the time that as Bob said, if you're not aware of it, then, you know, shame on you. But, you know, what's the responsibility of the providers to help secure you as you go forward? You know, back to when you were asking about this innovation piece, anybody that's not paying attention to innovation as part of their business is going to get eaten for lunch. That's all there is to it. Balancing your budget between what's the steady state of now and what does it look like in the future is the only way you'll stay alive in this world. And so, I mean, it puts a lot of stress on budgets, but I would just tell you from the threat and the, you know, the offensive piece, a big piece of our budget always had to be against that, what we thought was coming next. And maybe it's a little like gambling at a casino. You're betting on the come all the time. I don't know. But most of the time you get it right if you're paying attention to the right stuff. So the threat has not changed. I mean, it's still out there. It's just changed how it gets to you. They're still looking for the things that we were looking for in the past. That has not changed. But I think the ability to collect volumes of data versus the days when I was going and getting some guy to hand me a page full of secrets, it's changed in the volume that can be gotten to with the right motivation, time, and effort. And so I mean, that's kind of a long way to say, like, it's changed, but it's still the same thing they're after.
Yeah, yeah. You know, Yossi, I'm going to ask you to comment on something. In a minute, I'm going to ask the three panelists about OT and industrial control and so on. But share with us just a brief little overview of some of the risks that you've seen in OT environments as you guys have chased rogue devices and things. What are some of the more consequential threats that you see in things like industrial control networks or healthcare networks or places where there's tangible physical components and devices that if break could kill people? What have you seen?
Well, you know, first, I would start by saying that it's not an OT or IoT or specific application like healthcare or something like that. It's actually generic. We see that first there is lack of awareness to the possibility of attacking through hardware devices, and the ability for attackers to get into a green field unsecured is actually a dream of any attacker. Now, as Bonnie said, innovation is part of the security, and it's not nice to have, in my words. It's actually a critical path of, or critical part of any modern security system, because otherwise you leave your landscape kind of static. So it takes time, and the attackers will know exactly what you are doing. You need to move the floor all the time. You need to disrupt the landscape of your system in order to keep them, you know, awake at night and not actually sleeping a good sleep after taking your data, money, or whatever they can do. Now, eventually, what we experience is that there is an increase, actually dramatically increased in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's still very short time to see the trend since the COVID-19 started, but I'm sure we'll see actually even an increasing part of using outdoor devices in order to exfiltrate enterprises and of course government. Everyone moved to work from home. One day, 3-4 weeks ago, it depends where we are, we moved to work from home. Now, just think about that, that you are from New York, and everyone here in this panel, I guess, had the chance to get into one of the big firms in Manhattan. You have 50 security guards in the lobby, you have 100 security guards in the building, Goldman Sachs and all of that. For a reason, the same people, the same applications, the same data, the same customer threat now moved to be distributed between houses all around the states with no security, no physical security anymore. What does it mean? Is it a say that physical security was useless or not required? Or we moved to a place that we are in a great danger today, and no one has a control of what is being connected, what is being used. I keep telling people about a conversation I had a couple of days ago with a really large bank with their security team. And they are concerned about the ability now of everyone, every manager in the bank now has to keep working from home. So they need to sign on whatever loans of billions of dollars from their laptop maybe in a secured line, but what about the peripheral, the screen, the printer that is being connected, the internet router itself? There was a letter from a senator from Virginia to the vendors talking about that, but eventually the threat is uncontrolled. There is no visibility. No CISO today can come and say, well, the fact that I don't have physical security is okay because I have enough grip of what's going on. And just last week, we had a discussion with Bob, and Bob mentioned critical infrastructure. We have some electric companies working with us, and we are the same. Eventually, they have the SOC distributed to people's home now. They have the ability to control some power remote stations from someone's porch. No control is getting into a reasonable level of security unless you make sure that your infrastructure is your infrastructure and not someone else's. And that's a concern that I believe will be with us in the next weeks, months, and years. And our mission, of course, is to help and educate the market about that.
Yeah. Ed, what do you think? Any thoughts on Yossi's point about distributing the access to people's homes and maybe that symbiosis between physical and virtual security that was solved in the places where you've worked by just making everybody work essentially in a skiff, but then we don't have that luxury anymore. What do you think? What's changed there? And in a minute with Bob and Bonnie, I want to get into some supply chain issues. We'll head in that direction next. But Ed, I'm curious what you think about this topic.
Yeah, Yossi said it. He said it perfectly. We really need to consider the potential consequences of the changes in the environment and the work arrangements that we have. We could look to the Cloud Hopper activity linked to a China group targeting managed service providers. Many of these types of attacks are hard to defend against. So one of the things that you should ask yourself is, are we leaning on our MSPs to do more? Is it the right thing to do to have our employees or contractors monitoring and managing our systems from home? How does that change in the environment change our risk? Are you doing anything to bolster the secure remote environment or the remote management of your most critical systems and infrastructure? We should all be concerned about OT systems and infrastructure especially the ones that are supported through managed services. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One, managed service providers responsible for checking the health and status of SCADA infrastructure and auxiliary systems, we've seen often connected to the same OT infrastructure fabric. I've seen instances where organizations permit third-party managed service providers to have unfettered access to their infrastructure with no checks or protections in place. And those MSPs they were already a lucrative target before, and I think we're creating an even greater incentive to go after some of that remote workforce, because the actors can exploit those trusted connections, compromising one endpoint or one entity, and it could be a company or it could be an end user who's now working from home, and then using those credentials to move across to other trusted networks. I recommend that folks consider a combination of process and technology. It isn't always, technology is often a great example of a way of solving a problem, but it isn't always the only way. I think that there are some checks and protections that could be put in place that would make sense for businesses. Some of those might be time of use, access or geofencing. I can't tell you how often I talk to clients and I find out that they have those guys come in and manage our systems remotely, and they don't even tell us anymore when they do it. And it's amazing to me when we do a cybersecurity assessment, how often we find that that's the case. So I think whether you're limiting access through a combination of strong operational governance and fine grained access control, the key is really to pay attention to how that change in the environment affects you. And what's important is to not give the keys away without considering the change in risk.
Really good comments. A note to the participants here, keep the questions coming. I've been sort of monitoring the Q&A in the chat here, and there's a couple of questions that I think we've touched on. So keep them coming, and as we get a few more minutes, we'll start to address a few of the more specific questions. But Bob, what I'd like to do is ask you quickly for your thoughts, and I'll ask Bonnie to follow up afterwards on the issue of supply chain and how, you know, both in an ICS and also in a software context, how does this affect kind of our the threat landscape? Certainly with remote access, it causes people to make very fast, very rapid source selection decisions. If you've got all of a sudden support remote access and you got to do it in the next couple of days, you're probably not doing the kind of research you might have done in the past. Talk to me a little bit about and share with the participants your thoughts on the supply chain.
Sure.
Risk.
Yeah, I think the best way is to cite an example without naming the client. We found that a client who had contracted to a ICS monitoring company and who had been approved by the procurement office and actually had been reviewed by the security office was actually using software that was being developed and maintained actively in Russia. Now, how'd that happen, right? This is part of the U.S. critical infrastructure. You say, well, geez, what did you do? Well, I mean, you know, you asked us. So the subcontractor who was doing the monitoring, you asked them basically, you know, do you have any direct connections outside your network? They said no. But what they didn't ask them was, well, you know, how do you get your software updated, and who updates the firmware that you're using, right, to run your scanning test? And they themselves, believe it or not, honestly didn't know. It wasn't until we went back and actually looked at the modules and looked at who was providing the support to these, because it's a big company. And we looked back and said, well, who's providing the actual support? Who's providing the firmware updates? Lo and behold, we find this company in St. Petersburg. And yeah, we went back and we had to reveal that to the federals.
How would somebody do that? I mean, it's you have a background in intelligence. Just someone making a decision for the boss about buying some tool. How do they figure these things out? Because they're not so obvious, right?
It's so obvious to us, and you know, when you look back, you say, of course, it was such a stupid decision at the time. These organizations are highly decentralized, and you have a group who's responsible for doing the monitoring of a specific aspect of a network, of a SCADA network, right? And there's only a few companies who do it, and this company is located in the United States, and they're well known to provide this service, so you basically issue them a contract. You don't really ask them questions about, you know, how do you provide, who supports you to support us, right? And it was only through some other information we obtained that we actually looked back and saw, you know, who this contractor was contracting with. The company they were actually contracting with was a European company, which, as it turned out, was the front, for the company who was actually building the product. But they didn't know that. Okay, the contractor who was providing support didn't know that. They only knew it was a European country. The European company provided us with these updates. We went back and find out who the European company was. It took about, I don't know, 20 minutes of searching and questioning and calling on the phone. And we found out, in fact, that they were being supported by a company out of St. Petersburg. So it's just, it's very complicated. And people who don't have a sense of how intelligence actually, works, and just don't think in that milieu, I guess, don't ask the right questions.
Is it a big problem if you make that mistake? Like if it turns out that there's software support, product support from a place that may not be very friendly, is that really to introduce some significant risk, or do you think maybe we overplay that a little bit?
In this case, as it turned out, we did some analysis. It was fairly early in the, we were actually reviewing a new procurement, so it was actually fairly early. And it doesn't even seem like in this case there was anything sinister necessarily. Mm-hmm. It was just a question of, the right hand wasn't talking to the left hand, the procurement wasn't talking to the security people who weren't talking to the people who ran the industrial base. There was just not enough communications. I don't know if there was anything sinister in this case. Now, has there been situations? Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Bonnie, same sort of question. I'm curious what you think about supply chain and sort of foreign influence, and whether, I know when we were doing our prep, I was sort of playing the role of just devil's advocate, saying, maybe we make too big a deal out of this stuff. I'm curious what you think.
Well, for crying out loud, make it hard, will you? And Yossi and I have talked about this before. The good news for the attacker is you only have to get lucky once. And time is on your side from the attack perspective. Somebody will do something that will allow you to get in the door. That's all there is to it. The bad news from the side of the defense is you got to be successful every single time. And so you can increase your ability to defend if you pay attention. So, how many of us went, to Best Buy in the day and, and they wanted to bundle Kaspersky, virus protection with your computer, and said, yeah, sure, it's a good deal, I'll take it. And those of us that looked at it went like, not only no, but heck no. I really don't want that thing on my computer. Just even with that, you're allowing somebody into your computer because it is reporting back someplace. So, so as I said to my 18-year-old son one day, do you pay attention to what you do online? And he was like, what does it matter? And I said, well, there are people that could try to get to me through you. And again, as only a teenager could do to a mom, who cares about you? And I said, you're right. Me, they probably don't care much about, except me, the director of the Center for Cyber Intelligence. Perhaps there's a different perspective. And that was that moment where I saw his eyes get big and he had that aha moment. If you don't pay attention to what you have in your systems that an attacker could want, then you make perhaps foolish decisions about what you will introduce into your system. So you actually have to understand what you have that an attacker would want. Is it a criminal that just wants to ransom the heck out of you? As they've done to most of the hospital systems? Is it the Chinese going to Equifax to take out all the PII for whatever reason I don't understand, but I've got some pretty good ideas. What is it you have that they want? And then what are they willing to do to get to you? Don't make it easy.
Yeah.
When you get in a hurry and buy something, you make it very, very easy for people like me, to be perfectly honest with you. So at least make me work for it, for crying out loud.
Yeah, Yossi, talk to me about rogue devices. You're like the world's leading expert on this. How do you find them, and how important is it for people listening who may not know how that discipline works? Give us a little tutorial on how you go about finding them and why we should care.
I do want to answer your previous question first.
Oh, okay. Do that first,
chain.
and then do
just 2 sentences, simple and short. Agencies and government, and of course, big enterprises protect themselves of me getting in unwillingly, or actually without them want me in. Why don't they use the same way of thinking about their hardware and about their software. It should be the same. If you don't want me in for many reasons, you shouldn't use other proxy agents or spies in a form of technology, and not always people understand that, and not always the defenders understand that the way they prevent people of getting in should be the same way of preventing others from getting in. Now, back to your question about rogue devices. Eventually, when we started, we actually teamed up with our chairman, who's the former director of the Mossad, and his reaction was simple. Well, thanks God, it's not a solution that was in place when I was the director. But the second thing he said was, these rogue devices are exactly like you have your own spy in someone's location. So the way to fish them and the way to catch them, according to our approach, is actually by letting them incriminate themselves or itself. And the idea is that eventually a rogue device on the physical aspect of its connectivity behave differently, because you can spoof addresses and you can spoof protocols and you can convince monitoring tools and of course security tools that you are a legitimate part. It happened to NASA, it happened to so many other organizations around the world. But on the physical aspect, it's really hard, not impossible, but really, really hard to spoof the actual fingerprint or the DNA. I can actually convince people over the phone by actually faking my voice that I'm you, Ed. But it's really hard to convince them by actually fingerprinting on your desk, right? The fingerprint will be different. And that's actually, in essence, the technology. It's really hard to explain exactly how we do it. And of course, we'll be more than happy to talk to any of the attendees and try to assist in mitigating the risk coming from hardware. But eventually, the idea is that exactly like we find spies by actually letting them incriminate themselves in many aspects, we use the same technology in order to do it in the space of hardware.
That makes sense. So we have a question here from Greg, a participant, about zero trust. And I'm going to open it to Bonnie, Bob, and Ed, if any of the three of you would like to make a comment, just sort of tying this discussion into the architectural concept of zero trust security, which exists, with no perimeter. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Maybe Bob?
Yeah, Ed, you and I have been in the cybersecurity business for a long time. Mm-hmm. And to me, zero trust is just the latest cyber, bumper sticker for how to do cyber, right? We can talk about whitelisting, cryptography, IDS. They're all bumper stickers. It's all, I don't know. I know technology pretty well. I don't know what the hell zero trust is or what it means. Every company now relabels themselves as zero trust. From my perspective is, if you allow any device on your network and enable it with any degree of trust before you can authenticate it, that's a mistake. But that's not a new mistake. That's a mistake that we recognized many years ago. And then the idea of network isolation and allowing people, depending on their credentials and their accesses of what they can get access to, that to me is cybersecurity 101. If you want to relabel it as zero trust, to me it's just the latest fad. But it will also, like a hangnail, eventually, cure itself.
Excellent. That's a little bit of
naysayer view there.
It's good. I mean, that's why you and I stick around long enough. We can naysay. A question here from Michael about the current pandemic, and maybe Ed, I'll direct this one to you. Question is, during this pandemic where everybody's kind of using personal devices and working all over, what are some things that people should do? There's a suggestion here, maybe DLP or endpoint security should be used. Any advice for people as we work through this pandemic with this new work arrangement?
Sure. I'll offer three examples. First, I think folks should pay attention to trends. One of them, big obvious one, is there's been new phishing campaigns exploiting the current crisis caused by COVID-19, caused by the pandemic. We've seen an uptick in scanning for vulnerable VPNs so that you can mount, so that the adversary can mount attacks against remote workers. You know, one thing that you could do is think about the basics, right? I mean, DLP will help in certain circumstances, but I don't think in this case, my recommendation is to pay attention how the changes in the environment and the work arrangements impact your business or mission. Think about segregation or isolation of key people, process, infrastructure. And I think we can look to the crisis for some good examples or some parallels. Our doctors, nurses, and medical professionals have always been unsung heroes. But they don't just come and go as they please. Their schedules are very carefully orchestrated and regulated. And so too should your interactions with your infrastructure providers, your partners, and again, I say your managed service providers, because I think what's going to happen is a lot of folks are scrambling to try to make adjustments in the wake of the pandemic. So you got to ask yourself, what are we doing to make the adjustments on our end? And you know, the third thing that I would really point out to people is don't forget the basics. I can't tell you how often we would be talking about some really advanced technique when I was at NSA, and we would be talking with folks who are really excited about it. And then the more that we talk, we would realize, you know, that we're missing cyber hygiene. Cyber hygiene is not unlike washing your hands. You see, wash your hands everywhere. I think people care about that more now. Don't neglect the little things. And I'll give you a couple of examples related to that. Don't, if you rush, put a bunch of new equipment in the field to enable the remote workforce. You know, please pay attention to stuff like that. You have to take equipment off the shelf that you were intending to retire simply because you had to do it really quickly and you grabbed something and you got old Windows 7, Windows XP, or Mac OS. And we know that some firms have had to pull older, previously decommissioned equipment off the shelf. Don't make that mistake. You'll pay for it later. I think if you do the basics first, then you can look at layering on some more advanced technologies and capabilities. And DLP, I think, is not a bad technology, but I don't think that it would be appropriate in the context of pandemic without a thought about the architecture.
Very, very good. Now, Stephen has a question here. Yossi, I'm going to point it your way. It's about bug bounty and pen testing and having hackers come at your systems. I know you and I've chatted about this. What are your thoughts? Is that you enthusiastic about that kind of thing to reduce risk on a network?
Well, in a way, yes. You know, purple teams and all of these technologies today that are talking about continuous hacking and continuous pen testing are technologies that are valid. Again, there is no silver bullet solution. Pen testing and hacking your system in order to come out with better security is part of the solution. It cannot be the solution, okay? So, but always, you know, doubt your system, doubt your settings, doubt your policies, and triple check yourself every time. So solutions like that, yes, absolutely. And I think the government are doing it continuously. We see some solutions in the market that are actually providing quite efficient solutions. Some may say worse or good, but eventually way better than doing nothing. And yes, in general speaking.
Yeah.
Ed, can I comment on that?
Oh, you can, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. This is one where I got it wrong and had to change my mind. I was for a number of years anti-bug bounty and thought it was kind of just silliness. But I actually saw a client start using it in a really orchestrated and well-managed way. And you know what? It worked. They actually have statistics that can show you the amount of successful attacks against their public-facing websites before they engage bug bounty program and after, and you can see it sharply go down, almost to a negligible amount. So I'm a big fan.
It's pretty cost effective too.
It really is.
Yeah.
You pay a fancy consultant, $100,000, or you can pay through bug bounty a small fraction of that. You probably get better results in the latter case. So,
hey Ed, if you don't mind, I'll offer too. I think it's a culture thing. In some cases, you become stagnant internally. I think there's been a lot more of a move to secure DevOps or DevSecOps, where as a part of the culture, we're thinking about security. And I think bug bounties help promote that way of thinking for the workforce, because at least for the development part of the workforce, because you know that there's going to be a bug bounty or some sort of test. It isn't just static.
That's good. Bonnie, I've got one for you. So Mara is asking about security and risk frameworks and whether you would think that these are really effective in reducing risk, like maybe this touches on the relationship between compliance and security, but what's kind of been your experience in dealing with frameworks both in government and post-government?
You know, I would just tell you, in government, there was a lot of times when it felt like security was the tail that wagged the dog to some respect. You know, as a younger officer, it was like, oh my gosh, those guys don't want to do anything. As a more seasoned officer, it became, well, okay, so let me explain to you why we're going to say no to this, but yes to that. I think you have to balance between not doing anything, which is zero risk, and moving forward, which means you have to accept risk. And so if you put together a risk framework that says this is the stuff that absolutely cannot happen, but I'm willing to accept that this will happen to move my company forward, I think you've got a better idea of what you're dealing with. What you can't do is say, well, there's no risk here and just move blindly forward. But you can't say we can't accept any risk, because no risk means no forward movement. And so I think that that's where the companies have to weigh what the framework is going to look like. We've dealt with companies outside of government that, I mean, you know, you look at risk in insurance, right? I've asked a company recently, what are your insurers asking you for to get cyber insurance? Because, I mean, cyber insurers are asking for particular things from companies in order to insure them. Liability insurance isn't covering you anymore for cyber attacks. So part of what they're trying to get them to do is understand what is the risk that they are incurring with what they're doing. It's not saying be zero risk. I don't think there is any such thing. You know, getting out of bed carries risk. So powering up your computer carries risk. Be informed about where you're going. That's how you mitigate your risk. So Bob, were you saying something?
Yeah, I think the question was about the, the cybersecurity framework, the CSF, and I just wanted to make a comment that I think it's probably the most abused document in the history of the. I mean, what people have done to this poor thing, and what the industry has done to it to exploit it, it was never meant to be a Bible. Okay, it was meant to be a guide.
A guide.
To help you understand how to mature your cybersecurity program of your organization. It's been turned into a set of dogmatic codes that you must implement in an orderly fashion, and don't go from 1 to 2 until you've done all these things and you've done all the 853 controls. And what's happened is, I have a number of clients who try to use the CSF, and they lost the ball. They forgot what they were doing and why they were doing cybersecurity. Your big problem is APT 10 and APT 29. They're the person that's going to get the CISO fired. Not following the NIST framework, chapter and verse, is not going to get you fired. Okay, keep your eye on what your risks are, and use the CSF, but you use it lightly. Don't fall in love with it.
Yeah,
I like
fair point.
I like the way Bob put that, Ed. One thing I'd like to add is I think a lot of organizations think of the security people as the department of no. No, you can't do that. And, philosophically, I'm opposed to thinking about it that way, because I believe cybersecurity is an enabler. It can give you capabilities to do things that you can't do today securely, and maybe would enable you to expand and enter markets in a way that you can't. And when you work in an organization that embraces the spirit and intent, if not the letter of the law, but the spirit and intent that's imbued in a lot of those frameworks, then I think you get a lot of goodness.
Very good point. Yossi, this one's for you. It's from Elan. He's asking about visibility into OT networks. I'm curious if you have any advice for him.
Well, visibility is necessity. We don't need to teach anyone here about lack of visibility brings immediately a lack of security. The issue is that the definition of visibility in sometimes is too narrow. Because if you go to many people and ask them, what do you mean by visibility? Well, we mapped the network, we know the status of our active nodes, and we know everything about what's going on. But visibility means seeing what you don't know, not what you knew a minute before you ran the scan. What about the hidden parts of your infrastructure? What about the man in the middles? What about the tapping devices? Some of them were put intentionally by your technicians and they forgot about that and exposed you to 0 days or something else, but many potentially brought by bad actors. And visibility should be taken to that place, especially in critical infrastructure, in OT. And the fact that many experts forget about the unseen, and even in, you know, Bob mentioned the Bible, top and critical controls, the top 5 are not the Bible also, but number 1 talks about visibility and control of known and unknown. Unknown, people didn't listen to the entire sentence. Unknown parts, unknown assets. And the unknown is the risk, not the known. The known, if I'm the attacker, I'm not dealing with the known because you'll catch me. If I have an access to your infrastructure, I'll come from the angle of the unknown and you'll never catch me because you are not tuned to find the risk. And this is the way I'm looking in, and it's not just hardware, it's software also. Don't map what you know, map what you don't know. And that's the lesson I've been taught in the hard way sometimes, and hopefully people listen to that.
So thank you. Yes. So there's a question here from David. He says he's a smaller value-added reseller and asking how you kind of break through to the CISO. And I'm going to take this one because I think this is a topic.
Go right ahead.
Hear quite often. This question of when you're a smaller provider, how you gain access to the CISO. I think the answer is in the value proposition and kind of what you're all about, the belief. I see small companies talk a lot about what they do and often not why they do it. And when you're driven by that foundational belief, whether you're a VAR or a vendor or a consultant, when it's something like, I'm going to guess that with Bob Bigman, for example. Bob, if you weren't allowed to make another penny doing what you do, you probably would keep doing exactly what you're doing. You'd probably just keep going. I know that.
Well, I'm doing it because I'm not making a penny. And I'm still here.
You and me both. I don't have enough zeros in my checking account. But David, that would be my advice. Stick with it and focus on, you know, why you're doing the work you're doing. And, you know, when the bigger guys come along and, you know, in some sense, you said wine and dine customers. Well, let them do that. You focus on providing great value, and I know you'll be successful.
Yeah, and I'd also add, you know, why do you have to get to the CISO? I mean, you know, in some cases, that's the last person I would want to go. You know, you got to find the person who cares about your issue.
Yes.
You know, who needs your product, who cares. You know, that's who you want to talk to. It's usually not the CISO necessarily.
Now, we've got a question here from Kip asking about VPN. And I guess maybe any of you might have some questions about whether, you know, this new reliance on VPN is going to cause some problems for us globally. So
I'll give you one free hint. And remember this one. You know, SSL VPNs that run in the memory of your browser, not so good. IPsec VPNs, better choice. Okay, fair enough. Question here from Crystal, who has been very patiently waiting, asking about remote workforce. Bonnie or Ed, I'm going to ask one of you to comment. Do you think like going from a physical facility where we're all in the same building working to a remote workforce, can you secure that? Is it possible to recreate virtually the kind of protection that Bonnie, both you and Ed grew up with? Bonnie, I'll start with you. Like, can you recreate physical security virtually, or do you always lose something? You know, I think the fact that you think you've got virtual security is probably really the first misstep you've got. Mm-hmm. You know, I've long been an advocate of a layered strategic or a layered security plan. So there are no silver bullets in security. You're only as strong as your weakest link. And so, you know, when Yossi approached me and I talked to him, I mean, one of the things I like so much about Sepio is
that it's in a sector that is not typically looked at. So most of us focus on software. Yossi's really looking at the hardware side of things, which I really like. You know, there's the what and the how. How do you do what you do? And, you know, what is it you do? How you do is your people. So as you move them to a dispersed workforce remotely, you might increase your attack vector a little bit because they're going to be busy dealing with other things. And the opportunity to click on a link is greater than maybe if they were on an in-house system all the time where they're logged in through your network. But the more education you do up front, the better they help you secure your systems on the backside. Mm-hmm. So I think it's not something that you start doing the minute you put them remote. It's something you start doing before they ever go remote. And then you just continuously update it as they go. Going remote is not your problem.
Yeah.
Going remote without educating your workforce, that's your problem. Okay.
Yeah, you know, Ed, rather than you answer that one, thank you, Bonnie.
Okay.
Stephen and a few others are bringing up cloud, so it doesn't surprise any of us that that would come up in the discussion here. Ed, what are your thoughts on public cloud? And Stephen asked specifically about CASB, like a cloud access security broker, as a means for gaining visibility into cloud access from the enterprise. What's kind of what are your thoughts on cloud security and perhaps on cloud access in particular?
Yeah, I think a lot of, historically we looked at how do I move on-prem infrastructure into a cloud and let someone else worry about it. And we've seen that there are some consequences associated with not thinking about how you refactor. And a lot of the security brokers, I think, are a good way of thinking about refactoring without having to do everything from scratch. I think cloud should be a part of just about every organization's, not every, but just about every organization's strategy. I think that the key is stepping back and thinking about how architecturally it affects your enterprise and what steps you have to take to put the right controls in place so that you're within acceptable risk as your organization deems it. So I'm a big fan of enabling technologies. You shouldn't write crypto from scratch. You shouldn't, if you can avoid it. You shouldn't have to try to recreate the wheel. And I think a lot of those enabling technologies and brokering services are very good for most organizations.
Yeah, I would agree. I like them too. Bob, this one's for you, and it's about power grid from Michael. He's kind of saying pretty significant threats to power grid, and should we be doing maybe what the DOE has done and impose, you know, things like unidirectional security and other types of means? What are your thoughts there? I thought that was a good question.
Yeah, well, I wish all the power grids did use unidirectional security. Most do, some don't. Yeah, I'll be honest with you. It's easy to secure the power grid. It's not real hard. They don't all do it well. But you know, frankly, you can keep your infrastructure separate from your IT organization and use any number of secure gateways to move data back and forth, and they tend to work pretty well. You can't take those same measures and put it on the IT network to secure someone's internet connection, right? You've got to go both ways. You got to go out to sites that you don't know about. You got to bring down code you don't know from who, and you got to execute it in your network and hope for the best. So, you know, the idea that you can, move things in one direction, and secure your network, yeah, you can do it. But boy, I tell you, the CISO is not going to be the best person.
I think you're right.
You know, it's going to be a problem.
Well, on that note, I'm going to first of all thank the three of you for just being such wonderful panelists. It's a delight listening to you. Yossi, I'm going to turn it back to you for a couple of final points. And I want to thank the participants on behalf of our panel. But Yossi, a couple final thoughts.
You're muted. Yossi, you're muted.
Yossi, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you. Yep, you're all set.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. So, I just want to say thank you for all of you guys and the attendees. It is a pleasure. We do encourage you guys to talk to us in Sepio, realize more about the threat that comes from hardware. I promised it's not going to be art sale session here. So if someone is interested, our sales team is more than happy to assist. Our support team will be able to assist, and feel free to reach out. You will get some follow-up email. Thank you. And above all, thank you for making a donation by participating here. The COVID-19 Relief Fund will get $20 per each one of the attendees. We reached to a number of 150 people in this session, and it's a nice check. I'm sure my CFO will not be so happy, but thank you all. Happy Easter, happy Passover, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So long, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.